Hello everyone. In today's session, we're going to learn about project scope and project scope statement. Precisely, we're going to look at the following topics. What is a project scope? What is a project scope statement? Benefits of having project scope statement in your project. The defined scope process. When to perform the defined scope process. And what are the ITTOs of defined scope process? We're going to look at a simple project scope statement template. And finally, we're going to conclude this session with the primary differences between project scope statement and the requirements documentation. Let's jump on to the topic. What is a project scope? Your project must be aiming to deliver a product, a service, or a result. All the work that must be completed to deliver a product, a service, or a result is defined as project scope. We might have realized by now defining the project scope is a planning activity. While defining the scope of your project, you must consider two things. Number one, what is in scope for your project, and number two, what is out of scope for your project. Your project scope always must be objective. Project scope should follow the SMART characteristics. S stands for specific, M stands for measurable, A stands for attainable or achievable, O stands for realistic, and T stands for time bound. For instance, if your project scope has a statement that says initial project documents must be delivered early in the project, please note that the words initial project documents and early are subjective in nature. So this is an incorrect statement. The correct version of the above statement is the design documents of the project must be delivered by 31st March 2021. This statement is more specific to a specific set of documents and it is also time bounded. The statement also gives more clarity to both the customer and the project organizations. What is a project scope statement? We have already seen all the work that must be completed to deliver a product, a service, or a result is defined as project scope. So, where do you document your project scope? Project scope statement is the place where you document your project scope. Usually, the project scope is developed in an iterative manner. For instance, if your project has 4 or 5 iterations, then a high-level vision statement for the entire project is first developed to provide a big picture to the stakeholders. However, a detailed project scope statement will be developed for each iteration separately. Project scope is typically developed in a joint application design workshop. A joint application design workshop will have a moderator who is usually not part of the project. The moderator will organize the workshops with clear and unbiased agenda with help of project manager and other stakeholders. Now let's look at what are the benefits of having project scope statement in your project. Project scope statement acts as a single point of reference for all the stakeholders in terms of project scope. All the project stakeholders are going to be on the same page in terms of project scope. It ensures the project team to focus only on in-scoped activities. It ensures the project team and the project manager to prevent and avoid situations such as scope creep and goal plating. Scope creep is nothing but getting uncontrolled changes occurring continuously in the project. On the other hand, goal plating is a situation where and one or more of your project team members providing additional features or functionality to the customer, either to please the customer or to showcase his or her skills or for any other reason. Both scope creep and goal plating is bad practices and harm your project. Now let's look at the defined scope process. The defined scope process is part of project scope management knowledge area and planning process group. When to perform the defined scope process? If I put the same question in a different format, what are the inputs or dependencies for defined scope process? Project charter is an output of develop project charter process. Project Charter is the first document created in the project. It contains all high-level and precise information that is available during charter creation. It contains the following things, but not limited to: project objectives, high-level project scope description, which includes both in-scope and out-of-scope items, a brief description of the project manager if already identified during the charter creation, high-level schedules and milestones, and most importantly, the business case that explains the justification of why the organization chose this project, among others, the initial list of stakeholders identified during charter creation, high-level budget, project constraints, assumptions, and risks, if any. Project Charter contains all this high-level information. Hence, Project Charter is a good place to start defining the scope of your project. Identify Stakeholder Register. Stakeholder Register is an output of Identify Stakeholder process. Stakeholder Register contains the list of project stakeholders. Defining the project scope is not a one-man show. It includes close collaboration with project stakeholders. So, stakeholders register would be required as an input to define scope process. Project Scope Management Plan is an output of Plan Scope Management process. For all the knowledge areas, PMBOK follows that you first plan how the rest of the processes in the knowledge area are going to be performed before you actually perform those processes. Project Scope Management Plan is an output of Plan Scope Management process. Project Scope Management Plan will act as a blueprint for the rest of the project scope management knowledge area processes. So to define the scope of your project, it provides the approach of how to define the scope for your project. Requirements documentation is the primary output of collect requirements process. Requirements documentation is one of the primary input to define the scope of your project. Requirements documentation contains all the requirements collected during the collect requirements process. During define scope process, we take the requirements as an input to determine which of those requirements are going to be part of the scope of your project. So when to perform define scope process, precisely the define scope process must be performed only after completing the processes: develop project charter, identify stakeholders, plan scope management, and collect requirements processes. Let's look at the define scope process ITTOs: inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs of define scope process. Inputs. We have already seen most of the inputs of define scope process as dependencies in the previous slide. Let's look at the project documents that may be required as an input to define scope process. Assumptions log. Assumptions log contain all the assumptions identified in the project. In the specific case, there may be assumptions pertaining to the project scope. Risk register. Risk register may contain risk response strategies pertaining to the project scope. So to mitigate those project risks, we may need to adjust the scope. Enterprise environmental factors. Enterprise environmental factors are the cultural aspects and ways of working of your organization in defining the project scope. Organizational process sets are nothing but the project scope statement templates and lesson learned templates from similar historical projects. Now let's look at the tools and techniques. Expert judgment is taking SME help to define the scope of your project. The subject matter expert may have expertise in defining the scope for similar projects in the past. Alternative analysis is analyzing the alternative solutions available to meet some or more of your project scope items or requirements. Multi-criteria decision analysis is a technique that uses a decision matrix to refine the project scope and the product scope. One side of the decision matrix is criteria such as complexity, schedule, cost, etc. And the other side of the decision matrix is the alternatives available. Based on the weightage provided in the decision matrix, a decision will be drawn on the best suitable alternative for meeting the project scope needs. Facilitation is facilitating the joint application design workshops with the stakeholders to define the project scope. Product analysis is analyzing the features and functions that are going to be delivered by your project. As we all know by now, the primary output of define scope process is Project scope statement. Some of the project documents may also get updated during the define scope process. They are assumptions log. If any new assumptions identified or updates to the existing assumptions, the assumptions log will needs to be updated. Requirements documentation. If there are any new requirements identified or updates to the existing requirements, then requirements documentation must get updated. As and when the requirements documentation gets updated, its traceability must also be updated. And if any new stakeholders identified during this process, the stakeholder register must be updated. Now let's look at the simple project scope statement template. Project scope statement typically contains the following: a brief description of the project, which explains you the background or the purpose of the project. Product scope, which includes the features and functions of the product that your project is going to deliver. Project scope, which includes both in-scope and out-of-scope items. The list of deliverables that your project is going to deliver. Acceptance criteria, which is handshaken and agreed between the customer organization and the project organization. And if there are any assumptions, constraints identified during the define scope process, those must be documented in the project scope statement. Finally, now let's look at the differences between the project scope statement and the requirements documentation. For some of the PMP aspirants, it's little ambiguous the difference between project scope statement and the requirements documentation. As we have already discussed, the requirement documentation is one of the primary input to develop the project scope of your project. Eventually, project scope statement may contain a subset of requirements from the requirements documentation. Requirements documentation usually contains all the requirements that are identified during the collect requirement process. However, only a subset of those requirements will be categorized into the project scope. So project scope statement and the requirements documentation are not one and the same. Let's summarize what we have learned so far. Scope of a project is defined as all of the work that must be completed to deliver a product, a service, or a result. Project scope statement will act as a single point of reference for all stakeholders in terms of project scope. The define scope process must be performed only after the processes develop project charter, identify stakeholder, plan scope management, and collect requirement processes. Define scope process ITTOs, inputs being project charter, stakeholder register, scope management plan, and the requirements documentation. Tools and techniques being facilitated workshops, product analysis, multi-criteria decision analysis, alternative analysis, and the expert judgment. Outputs being project scope statement, project document updates. The project documents that gets updated during this process are assumptions log, requirements documentation, requirements traceability, and stakeholder register. Project scope statement includes the project objectives, project scope, both in scope and out of scope items, product scope, which are features and functions of the project, deliverables, acceptance criteria, constraints, and assumptions. This is all for today's session. If this video is useful, please do not forget to like it and share it. Please subscribe to the channel to stay updated on the upcoming free PMP and project management videos. Thanks for watching.